everyone. My name is Jesse Chason with Lisa Blanchard as the host of Airing Addiction.
I share often my journey started on this campus. Got sober as a client here, just like you.
I really do see phenomenal change.
Always hope. I've seen situations that on the surface look impossible become possible.
Doing this podcast is to share those recovery stories, be honest about what the challenges are and have some real conversations, but kind of share that out on the airwaves.
Welcome everybody to this episode of Airing Addiction. If you are watching this on video or as you listen, you might notice that we're missing a counterpart here. So unfortunately, Jesse, my co-host, is not feeling great. So we're all just going to send him some wonderful positive energy and hope that he is feeling better soon. But the show must go on. So here we are today on this beautiful May day. We are here on our beautiful Westboro campus. So if you're watching this on video, you can see just how gorgeous a day it is behind us. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So today our guest is actually a good friend and colleague of mine, Mathew Roosa. He's a consultant that I've done actually a fair amount of work with, and he's been doing for many years, longer than me, training and coaching and technical assistance for universities, research studies, governments, and often, health and human service providers and many providers that do substance use treatment and addiction treatment. He's a founding member of NIATx, so I would actually really love to talk about that because that is one of my passions as well. Works at the University of Wisconsin, Madison Center for Health Enhancement Systems Studies, CHESS for short, providing training and technical assistance. And so he's got a lot of wonderful experience, both clinically and with quality improvement and evidence-based practices. And so we're really excited to have Matt here today. So Matt, welcome.
Thank you, Lisa.
We get to check in on projects regularly, but
we do.
New opportunity for me to talk directly to you about kind of your history, how you got to this place of training and consulting and technical assistance. Like if you want to start us off with a little bit about you and how you kind of got into this field and how your career has landed where it has.
Yeah, happy to. I started out as a social worker, a clinician. I did a lot of family therapy, individual therapy. I was lucky enough to be in environments that were integrated with mental health and substance use services within those environments. Those were, at the time, for-profit agencies in an era where the economy of the industry was a little different, and there were quite a few of those smaller for-profit kinds of agencies and organizations. So I spent a good number of years in that environment as a clinician and then as a administrator doing that work, and was able to have that experience with a more integrated model, which was not that common, and unfortunately is not as common as I wish it was today. And then after doing that, I moved into governmental planning, where I did a lot of work in quality improvement and planning with a county-based system across mental health and substance use and developmental disabilities areas. I'm working with all the providers in that region to support, and then working across the state. I live in Syracuse, New York, upstate New York. So working with most of the large counties in upstate New York. I did a lot of work with folks in Rochester and Buffalo and Syracuse, where I live, working on a number of different initiatives, promoting different kinds of practice implementation and quality improvement work. And as I was doing that, I was starting to get engaged with the NIATx model and with NIATx at its inception during that time. And so that became a core orientation for me around quality improvement. That actually started when I was with an agency as a clinical director, and that's how I became involved with NIATx. And then I made that transition into governmental work, and then started to work with NIATx and started to do consulting work at that time as a part-time thing. Doing different projects with different systems around the country, and then transitioned out of that governmental role into full-time consulting during COVID was when that happened. I made that transition during that period, and so since then have been working with a lot of different systems, as you mentioned earlier, mostly in the areas of quality improvement, mostly a lot of it implementation support for evidence-based practice, also training on some evidence-based practices. The origins of all of it was, me trying to understand stuff, find answers, coming from a family with some significant amounts of substance use and mental health challenges and struggles, and having my own experiences, and then trying to understand those things. And that's kind of what got me rolling in terms of my career path.
That's great. I'd love to dive more into so for those that are listening, which is not you and I, because we both know it very well, can you describe a little bit about what the NIATx model is, and maybe even like some of the interesting kind of origin story of it, and how you maybe use it today?
Yeah. So NIATx came about 25, 26 years ago or so, um, as a result of some initial research around quality and organizations that trying to understand organizations that were good at doing quality improvement, making change. It came out of the work of Dave Gustafson and Todd Mulfenter and some others at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who were very interested in health science systems, in healthcare, and in process engineering. Right? These are engineers. This work has its origins in an engineering program. Right? So process engineering. So thinking about process improvement. How do we change the process in order to improve the experience for the customer or the patient, with a particular focus for NIATx around access and retention. How do we give people better access to care? What's it like when you have to find an office? What's it like when you have to transport yourself to an office when you don't have a car? What's it like when you have to sit in the waiting room for an hour and a half and then fill out tons of paperwork where you have to write down your phone number and your address 6 times? Does that make you more or less likely to want to come back? What do we do to create welcoming environments? What do we do to create an experience that helps to engage? And so there are 5 key principles that NIATx uses, which I think really tell the story of what it's all about. The first one is understanding the customer. What does our customer need and want? What's their experience? The customer is always right about how they see the world, what they experience, and we need to honor and appreciate that if we want to effectively engage with them. The second one is having powerful change leaders, finding people who have good energy and focus on building change, and making improvement. The third one is fixing key problems of leadership. Whatever we try to work on, we have to make sure that it aligns with core values of our leaders. It has to have a business case. We want to promote change. We can't say, hey, this is a great idea. It's going to cost us a ton of money that we don't have, but it's a really good idea. Let's do it. That's not viable. It doesn't have likelihood of success. We have to think about the leaders, the priorities of our leaders. The fourth one, getting ideas from outside of the field. What do other industries do that we can adopt, right? Because you have a lot of residential beds, and you probably have implemented a lot of things that maybe ideas that you've gotten from, hey, look what that hotel does, or hey, look what that service industry does. Hey, we could do something like that to make people feel good when they come in the door for the first time. So, you probably can think of examples right now of those kinds of things that you've done. And the last one is using PDSA, rapid cycle change. So this very commonly used model for implementing change where we plan, do, study, act, PDSA. We plan a change, we do it, we study the results, and then we take action. And so we try to do these things quickly and in a focused way and learn as we go. So those are the principles, and that's kind of the core of what the model is all about. And it uses certain tools that are really effective in helping people to do that stuff.
And really the thing that's always struck me, right? And maybe not quite the origins, but pretty far back in the early 2000s is when I was involved in a study in NIATx 200 in Massachusetts, and then became a coach after that, shortly after that, because I really grabbed a hold of the model, is how simple it is, right? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't, it's that idea that, there's a lot of quality improvement models out there, and a lot of them say the same thing, but a lot of them require a lot of, or they say you need a lot of training and you need a lot of things, that certifications that cost money, and really that's not always accessible to behavioral health providers who, are often, working with smaller margins and or with really high risk, high need individuals and don't have a lot of time to just go spend weeks on end, months on end being trained in a model that just helps them make changes in their organization. And, the simplicity of this, I mean, you just did it, right? In like how many minutes did that take to
Yeah,
describe the model? And you really can start to do something with it. Of course, there's more to it, and there's ways that we can support folks. I would be remiss if I didn't just acknowledge the recent passing of Dave Gustafson, the founder of this model. Really, I've had some interactions directly with him, but you've probably had many, many more. And so, just my condolences to you for that loss
yeah,
and to the field. But through work like you're doing, that we get to continue his mission, right, and get to
yeah,
continue his really strong model of putting the person at the center, and then just learning how
absolutely.
processes impact them.
Yeah, from an engineering perspective, he was, I think, paralleled what we would see as the best provider of direct services. He was always very interested in individuals and always asking good questions, and genuine questions, and then waiting for answers. I mean, he was a pretty powerful guy in the field, and everybody knew him, and yet he remained very humble and very much oriented toward how people could teach him things. And if they taught him, if he stayed open to learning, that he would understand something better and that he would be more effective in doing what he was trying to do. And he lived that in a way that was really impressive to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can remember real many, many, many years ago, I had a poster presentation at a conference, and he was there for it because I think it was a kind of NIATx focused conference. And he comes up to the poster presentation, and he just like calmly sat there and asked, "Oh, tell me about that," like, and asked
Right.
such great questions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think at the time I didn't even know who he was, even though I
Right.
think I was already a coach at that point, but I hadn't met him in person yet. And then I found out very quickly, what his background was and who just approached my poster. And it really
Yeah.
struck me just the calm, humble curiosity
Oh
with
yeah.
which he just asked questions of this, 20-something-year-old to
Right, right. Yeah,
help post this
he had a right,
center.
if anybody, sorry, if anybody had a right to have some swagger, he did, but he was always very kind of down to earth and very humble, yeah, which is nice.
Yeah, yeah, so fantastic. So I've certainly grabbed hold of this model myself. We use it across Spectrum and New England Recovery Center, and have for many, many years. And it's just the way with which we approach change. So we even have a new executive director of quality improvement. But she went right to your training,
Nice.
and really immersed herself in understanding what this model looks like, and then applies it, to the work that we do. And I think a couple of things that I think are really great conversations to think about is this perspective, that we live in the model and we live in our work, that I think the field in general is just starting to grab onto, is this idea of putting the person that we're supporting or serving at the center, right? That exactly how you said it, right? The customer is always right about their experience, right? They're always the expert in their own lives, in their own experience. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you have seen in the field evolve, and sometimes maybe not as quickly as we'd like or as spread as we'd like, with taking that perspective instead of what often has been a very kind of, paternalistic approach to addiction treatment, where like, this is the path you must follow. I know the right answers. If you follow this exact path, you will achieve recovery, instead of really working with what that person knows about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's yeah, as you well know, easy to say and hard to do. And we have a long history of asking people to fit a program, and having the program kind of be standardized and asking people to come into it and sort of squeeze themselves into it, whatever shape it is, instead of saying, who are you, and tell us about what your life is, and let's explore what you need and what do you understand to be your needs, and how can we partner with you based on your understanding of what your needs are and build something around the shape of you, right? What is it that you need? And so that requires, and many systems have said, well, we can do a little bit of this person-centered stuff, but it's just not practical because of resources and economies of scale, and we can't just build a new thing for everybody. Well, when in fact we can and we should, and it doesn't require more resources. It requires that we use our resources differently, right? It's perfectly manageable, but it's counter to our prevailing long-term culture, which is that we have to get people to comply with certain standards. I use the word comply intentionally in air quotes, not the kind of language I like, to because we know better, because we know best, and they don't know, and they're struggling because they don't know, and we do know. So let's get them to do, which is not true, and we've seen the results when we do that, which is that people don't stay connected to what we're offering if we're not offering something that's oriented toward who they are and what they want and what they need and what their experience is. Again, the customer is always right. Imagine trying to sell something. I sometimes use silly metaphors like if someone walks into a car showroom and says, "Oh, I'd like to buy this car, and I'd like to buy it, but I don't like the color. It's a used car." And the salesperson says back, "Well, that's an awesome color. It's really popular. People love that color. But I don't." "Yeah, but it's really a great color." "Well, I'm walking out now, right? Because you've failed to appreciate that I don't see it the way you're seeing it, and I won't be able to stay connected to you unless you can get that I have a different vision of the world here. That's the only way you're going to be able to sell me a car." And when we're trying to engage people in care, it's not that different. We're trying to help to understand who they are. People who are good at selling things first understand what the customer needs and wants and values. And we have to do the same thing, and that's that person-centered orientation. And a lot of systems are starting to make change. I'm really excited about the new ASAM criteria, right? ASAM-4 is really about the implementation of ASAM-4 is really about individual choice, making sure that service plans are completely oriented toward, not completely, but have a primary orientation toward how people experience their own needs and that they're actively involved. And we've given some priority to that idea for a while, but I think we're starting to see it being uh, institutionalized in some of our standards, right? And so I'm optimistic that this is a chance for us to take a next step up. We'll still be working, still not, it's going to be a long time before we're going to continue to have to climb this hill, but this is a good next step to say these things are critical, and our standards should be able to record and identify how engaged our customers are in the creation of their plan, right? They should be active members. And the ASAM criteria now, I think, is going to do that better than it has before.
Right. It's really about taking the philosophy and not just saying that's our philosophy, right? And then maybe when you sit down to do an individual care plan or individual treatment plan, that you ask them questions. Like that's how people often view. I'm doing person-centered care. I ask them what they wanted on their treatment plan.
Yeah.
But then they still have to fit into the groups and the counseling and the structure and the things that we require because we know this is best.
Right.
And it always strikes me, I include in a lot of trainings that I do, this image, which I think comes out of the Harm Reduction Coalition. I can't find the origins of it anymore, so I just kind of loosely credit the Harm Reduction Coalition, of a tree. I don't know if you've ever seen this one, where it's like the root of like what you believe about people really is what creates kind of what the systems you put in place. And so if you believe that people are not trustworthy and can't take care of themselves and don't want to change, then you're going to create structures that require you to fit a certain mold in that, you have to do it for them because they won't do it for themselves, instead of if you believe that the roots of all people are that they actually know what they want, they have they're trustworthy, they have the ability to do that, then you decide with them what that looks like and you just help them through it. And really, starting with that orientation, one of the things that we've done, I'm in charge of the clinical design across all of our systems. And, we are a large provider. We have 14 and 15, if you count a medication unit, opioid treatment programs across the state and in prison. So if you add the prison, it's another 10. And we, had treated about 6,300 people a day, right? So we are a big system, and there is definitely kind of that feeling that like, well, it needs to be structured in order to do this with this many people. We need to do it exactly this way. And really, we blew that completely out of the water. And our clinical design for our opioid treatment programs is 100% individualized, right? There is no one path. There is a conversation that says, right now, what do you need? What are your priorities? Do we need to help you with transportation first and housing? And what do we need to get you what you need to be, to work towards your own goals? What are your goals? Yeah. What do you care about, right? And not having those tied directly to a specific toxicology screen or path. And, as that shifts over time, keep having that conversation. Would you want to try a group? Do you think that would be helpful? Why don't you try one? Instead of, everybody is in weekly group here and you have to do that. And it has to be Tuesdays at 10 for the rest of your life. Like that feels very different to people. And then, and if you want to try a group, you can. Here's the ones that we have available. Here's what might be helpful for you, but you decide, right? How often can we meet individually, right? I'd love to connect with you once a month just to make sure you're doing okay. And because I care about you. But beyond that, like, how often can you get here? Right. How often do you want telehealth? Do you want in person? Like, and have it be one, like there's no one size fits all. It's 100% individualized, and it can change in either direction depending on what that person wants or needs.
Yeah. And to what degree does our language reflect that value system? A good example, you mentioned opioid use treatment. For the longest time, we used the acronym MAT or MAT or medication assisted treatment. Now, a lot of people have changed the acronym because of this issue and call it medication for addiction treatment, or use a different, or you just say MOUD, medication for opioid use disorder. But the medication assisted treatment had a built-in assumption, which is that this isn't the treatment. This is assisting the treatment. The real treatment is talking to people and having a therapist and going to group. Now, I'm a big fan of therapy and a big fan of groups, and I used to do a ton of both of those things. But when we use that language, we're saying that this is just designed as an assist, right? You can't have standalone just medication as treatment. That's not legit. And there are many people who say, I've done all those other things, or I don't want those other things. I just really need access to the medication that works well for me. And we've had a lot of provider systems that have said, well, we don't do it that way. So again, forcing the person to comply with a model rather than trying to understand that individual's needs. And of course, what happens when we do that is the person doesn't stay connected, right? They don't stay involved. They disappear because you're having them do things that they don't value, that they don't appreciate, that they don't want. So it doesn't work well.
Exactly. And I love the, discussion around language because, we've had an entire podcast on language here. But there really is, a lot of inherent assumptions in the language that we use when talking about individuals we're supporting, and when talking about the treatments that we offer, and when talking about pathways, and and shifting that language does make a difference. Like we don't use that kind of language for any other medication in any other kind of health system, right? It's just part of what you're using for your own health and wellness, right? Like nobody says like that insulin is, a medication assisted treatment. It's just your body is not producing insulin in the way that that somebody else's might, and this is supportive to you to manage your blood sugar. Like that's really what we are doing with medications, and the evidence for it is unbelievably compelling, right? There's nothing out there in any other system, including life-saving cancer treatment, that save the amount of lives that medications for opioid use disorder do. Yet stigma is such a big part of, how we treat these medications and how we treat individuals who may be interested in taking these medications. When you're coaching and providing TA, where do you see that stigma kind of still present, right?
Yeah,
Even folks aren't aware of it, and they say, "Well, I don't have stigma," but where do you kind of see that show up?
And I try to look at it from a position of empathy rather than judgment. I think that we're all victims. I mean, segregation is a harsh thing, and I think about it culturally, and And in other ways, and sort of thoughtful thinkers, people like James Baldwin and others who have said segregation hurts everybody. And in our healthcare systems, that segregation has hurt everybody. The segregation of mental health and substance use services out of what we call primary care, right? I like to say all healthcare is behavioral. When you go to your primary care, what percentage of the conditions for which you visit your primary care do not have a substantial behavioral component, as in what you do, the choices that you make, the things that you do, the things that you eat, the activities that you take, whether or not you take medications according to the prescription, et cetera. There's behavior involved in all of them, right? The fact that we've sort of segregated out mental health and substance use concerns is at its root this kind of core stigma that we carry, where we say it's kind of an optional care. I remember having a conversation with a pediatrician who said, I don't have time to screen these teenagers for substance use, and then I don't have time to connect them to care if they do have a substance use issue. And I said, well, you seem to find time to take every one of their blood pressures and weigh them, and you have time to take their blood pressure. How often does that result with teenagers? Once in a while, like 1 out of 1,000 maybe have a blood pressure issue, but the percent who have a substance use issue is exponentially higher. And yet we're saying that that's an option for you, that you don't have time to do it, but you always have time to take their blood pressure because that's what your system has decided is your function, is your primary, and that this other stuff is not really primary, right? And so until we're able to, and we're still struggling, right? And all of these systems, all the folks in these systems have been sort of trained up in this model of segregated, and that's sort of if you can do it, it's great, and that's highest standard of care. But if you can't, that's okay. And we're hopefully starting to move toward a place where we're saying it's not okay. This is all part of primary care. All healthcare is behavioral. Behavior drives everything. And as you said, if we take a look at fatalities and disability and lost work hours and all the primary metrics as it relates to substance use and mental health, it's the most impactful area. And we have to find a way to make sure that every primary care provider sees it that way. And we're slowly chipping away. And I always try to look at these nurses. I had my own primary care visit the other day, and the nurse who was doing the assessment said, "You don't have a problem with drugs or alcohol, or do you?" And I just stopped for a minute and said, "Oh, I said to her, "Oh, that's just such a bad question." And she sort of got surprised, and I said, "Well, let's think about that question." I said, "You have evidence-based questions." And she got kind of frustrated. She said, "Well, I could ask you all 6 of these questions on the screen." I was like, "Yeah, that's the evidence-based screening you're supposed to ask me." But again, it's not her fault. Her vision is that that's not required. It's optional, and she's in a hurry and she's moving fast. She definitely took my blood pressure and checked my temperature and did my pulse, but that stuff didn't rate. Those questions didn't rank as priority for her. She doesn't see that as a requirement of the engagement with me, the front end assessment at the beginning of that visit. And that's not her problem. That's a systems problem that hasn't oriented her towards seeing that that's just as important as any of those other elements. You have to find out about that stuff.
And are predictive of, health outcomes, like
Yeah.
predictive. And so even when you were describing the blood pressure, I think that's such a great example, particularly with teenagers, right? But those are vitals, right? And so like when all nurses are trained on vitals, I have a daughter in nursing school, like this is really what everybody is trained on. And those things are what everybody does because there's a lot of evidence that by doing those, you will screen and prevent and support folks for, health concerns.
Yeah.
And just the fact that we also know that these evidence-based screening questions will also screen and prevent and support access to care, right, and improve health outcomes, but we still don't do it, right, really is a true systems problem. And, the other half of that systems problem is, and I think we see this too on the, suicide screening side as well, is, that you don't, and even in my own programs, like it's like reinforcing this because there's an element of like, you don't want to ask questions you don't want to know the answer to, because then the access to support that person is hard, right? And that's one of the real systems issues that I think we'd be easier to move the needle on like the screening part if there was ease of access for a primary care provider to immediately connect that person they're screening to evidence-based treatments like medications, like, treatment supports, whatever it might be for that person, in that moment, like they can, if your blood pressure was, impacted.
Yeah. I've had this experience dozens of times where people ask me, well, what do you do? And I say, well, I do consulting in healthcare. And they lean forward. And then I describe the sector, which is, mental health, substance use services. And then they lean back. And then they get a little anxious and a little nervous, unless it's their work, which usually isn't. And then they say something like, well, yeah, I guess that's really important. But they get nervous. And it's just it's sad, the pervasiveness of that discomfort around talking about these things, the tremendous stigma that we see across the board, where people are just still struggling with this anxious response and discomfort around talking about these things. It's deeply embedded cultural norms and worldviews that we're still burdened by dramatically.
Do you see any bright lights or silver linings? I mean, I see, I also do some clinical work still and see a fair amount of adolescents, and I see it with their parents, right, who got them to me. So like that was at least helpful. But there is starting to be a bit of a changing conversation about transparency about these things. Do you see any kind of bright lights coming?
I do. I really do. And it's all about exposure, giving people the opportunities. I've done a good amount of work with HIV/AIDS service providers, helping them to implement substance use screening. And I remember getting kind of knocked over when some of the HIV/AIDS service systems staff would say to me, I don't know, I'm just really uncomfortable asking people about substance use. And I remember saying back to them, you asked them about sex, like all day long. You asked them about all of their very detailed sexual practice information that you gather. And I make the joke to them. I was like, I'm really nervous about talking about that. That makes me very uncomfortable asking strangers about their sexual practices, because I never did that in my work, unless it was specific to the person. It was not an everyday occurrence, whereas the substance use was an everyday occurrence. So it's just this really good example of just this exposure. So they started doing it, and then they got comfortable, and then it was like, oh yeah, we know how to ask questions about sensitive things, or things where people may have reactions or privacy or discomfort around the topic, because it's very personal. And we just need to practice it. And once they do, they're fine. They're perfectly able. So I think that makes me hopeful when we see that people, if they're given the opportunity and given the chance to understand the importance of it, and given the chance to see how critically it connects to what it is that they do. These HIV service systems, obviously the rates of infection, sexually transmitted illnesses which relate to substance use, and rates of people engaging in more high-risk sexual behavior while under the influence of substances, and all of these, once they see those points of connection, they start to see, oh, this is central to our mission. This is a very important part of what we do. And then they're good. And then they start to sort of see it as their work. It's not extra. It's not an add-on. It's their work.
Yeah. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about, how to support systems through change, because I know you have an awful lot of experience doing that. How do we get buy-in, and maybe some of that is the PDSA process of pilot testing and trying things and having it be less big, right, on a small scale. But what are your thoughts about, when you approach kind of a system that you can see clearly needs to change, but where do you start from, and how do you start to move that system towards the changes that they need to make?
Yeah, a few things that I think are most important. I'll always be doing it from a team context. Anytime an organization sends one person to a training to learn how to do something, to bring it back and implement it, I often say, this might sound cynical, but don't bother. It won't work. Right? Because that person will not have the power and the influence to introduce a completely new construct or orientation to your broader system. It's going to just fade away really quickly. We need to have a team orientation with a small group of people who are dedicated and focused and working together actively. And there has to be alignment between whatever that team change initiative is and the executive sponsorship, the leadership of the organization. We're back to those NIATx principles, right? Fixing key problems of leadership. This has to align with what our leadership thinks is important, right? So we've got these executive sponsors, we've got this small team with a change leader who's focused. Again, this is kind of core to the NIATx model. And then we have to build some trust. I think team and trust. Coaching to me is about working with a team, building trust by listening to them, asking them questions. Back to the stuff we were talking about with Dave Gustafson. You build and cultivate trust in the process, trust in the practice, and in the team. So that trust becomes critical. Any team that does anything well has to trust each other. They have to trust the person who's coaching and leading them, to help them, to support them. And then 3 kind of open-ended questions I always think are critical. What's the why? Why are we doing this? What are our core values? What's our worldview? What's our belief? Why is this important? And then the what? What is the practice? If it's an evidence-based practice, have we learned it? Do we understand it? What are we doing? And what are the details of how we're going to do that? And then the how, which is where we get to the process. And that's the part that's so often missing. People get a lot of the why and the what, like, well, this is important. Let's go learn this new practice. Okay, everybody, go do it. And then there's no energy given to the how, to the implementation. What's our process for how we're going to roll this out? Is it just at one clinic or one office? Will we do it everywhere? Who's going to organize it? How will we keep measuring it? Will we do PDSA cycles? Will we have some kind of key performance indicators which will show us if we're continuing to do it and will give us some guidance so as to know how we need to adjust? If we're not doing those things, then it's, as I like to say, like pouring water into a dry beach. We pour that water into the dry beach, which is this great evidence-based practice, and we've all had this experience of people learning an evidence-based practice, getting excited, and then coming, back into their work environment with the strong intention to implement and to be successful with this. And then stuff happens, and then a month goes by, and 2 months go by, and then 6 months later, everyone's pretty much forgotten what they had learned, and we got to start over. Because we didn't have the how figured out. We didn't have the process for implementing figured out. The other metaphor I use a lot is painting a room. We also, what's painting a room? Oh, you just open up the paint, throw it in the thing, and start putting it on the walls. Well, we know what that looks like, right? If we do it that way. Most of the work happens before we even open the can of paint in order to have a good paint job. There's all the prep work. And we often skip that when it comes to doing change. We skip that work, and so the results are not what we had hoped for. So how do we get a system to understand? And that's where I think good coaching and support comes into play, which is to say, you need to do these things. We have lots of evidence that shows that this is what good implementation looks like. And we have this emerging field of implementation science, which gives us lots of great insight and awareness about what works when it comes to implementing a new practice. We know what the evidence says about these practices. Now we know what the evidence says about how to implement them. We put those two things together, then we're in business.
That's so great. And it also, the clinician in me too, always, it really sees the symmetry, between kind of doing motivational interviewing with an individual person you're supporting and doing this kind of work, which is really motivational interviewing for the team, right? It's really helping that team figure out what matters to you, right? So that's that why.
Yes.
What are the things that you are interested in changing? Not what I want you to change, because I could come in with a long list of things that I think you might want to do, but what are you interested in changing? And then let's walk through together that how, which is really that process. And too often you have this philosophy, right? So I think a good example of this is, we've been doing this work for a long time. And, we have both, ASAM level 3.7, 3.5 residential programs and all of these outpatient programs. So we've always had a process and the ability to start someone on medication while they're in a bedded program. And people were doing it, right? It was happening. But we were like, it's not happening as much as we think it should. So how do we change that? And really, it was like looking at that process and realizing we actually didn't have, and we had ways to get orders and to do all of those things once somebody was interested. What we didn't have was a structured process that created conversation with the person that you're working with about the fact that we can do this and are they interested, and let's give you some information about the evidence base. So
Yeah.
we created a change team that looked at developing a clinical process that just was as simple as training all the teams. So the prep work, right? Like you do, like all the work you do before you paint the room. If we didn't do that first, then that would not be helpful because it needs to be the entire team, right? Including the milieu staff that are there, 3 to 11, and might be having conversations with those that might be interested in medications. And then having it be included in every clinical encounter, right?
Yeah.
Where we're just, those are things we have to do per requirements, insurance, and we want to because the goal is to support somebody when they leave. But how do we actually put that right in the note, like right in our electronic health record? So every single time we talk to you, we're just having a conversation. And then look at the data to see, does that equal more people who are initiating medication while in a safe, secure residential space? And the answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
It's just a good example of following those kinds of processes.
Yeah, and you're describing your use of one of those core NIATx tools, which is flow charting. Do we do a process map that helps us to articulate every detail of how we're doing what we're doing in the sequence, and then to look at that and say, oh, there's something missing here, or we don't have a really overt way of managing that. A lot of our systems make improvements, and they're what I call the string around your finger. Like, hey, don't tie a string around your finger. Don't forget to do this. And if that's our process, we're going to forget. It's not going to happen. It has to be built into our standard operating procedure, right? This is what we do every time, and this is our new thing, and this is how we've adjusted it. Now we have to practice it, and we have to have it mapped out, and we have to have all of our supervisors and all of our staff talking about how we're doing this new thing and how it's going until such a point as it becomes institutionalized. For example, with our primary care conversation previously, I've yet to hear a nurse say, oh, darn it, I forgot to take their blood pressure and their temperature. They just don't do that. It's so deeply embedded in their sense of what they're supposed to do every time they room that person. There's no way it's going to get skipped. It can't get skipped. This other stuff needs to have the same level of process, focus, and standardization. And once it does, we're good. It'll happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else you would want to talk about before we end about kind of supporting folks through change and what our systems need to do to just make some shifts?
I would just, we mentioned the idea of questions earlier. A lot of times when people are working with consultants or coaches, they want answers. They want answers. Tell me how to do this. And it's kind of, it can sometimes coaches and consultants can be encouraged toward being the answer givers, right? Becoming the subject matter experts. And I think that's a slippery slope toward a very problematic space, which is dependency, right? This system that we're working with has lots and lots of knowledge and skill and wisdom. My sense of the view for anybody in those roles, whether it's being a supervisor, being a coach, being a consultant, is that you have to be the person who can see the system and ask questions, right? Ask questions of the system. The system has the knowledge and the wisdom. We just have to help them to find the right questions and then to work through those answers toward the path. It's not about having knowledge and information. As I say, knowledge and information is really cheap and easy. It's everywhere. It's on my phone. Every bit of information I could ever want is all here and within my grasp in 10 seconds. That's not the problem when it comes to implementing new things. We know all of the information. It's easily and readily available. What we need to do is ask the right questions, and they're usually about how we think about the world, what our vision is, what our values are, what our worldview is, what's our culture organizationally. And those are the things that systems sometimes have a hard time seeing. It's hard for them to look in the mirror and say, how do we see the world? What's our core value system like? But that's what that external party can do, is to help them to see those things and then address the challenges that result as they're trying to do something new. So I think that focus on questions is really important.
I love that because there's a lot, I just came from a large national conference and There are a lot of consultant systems out there that really will do that. Like, we'll come in and be like, here's all the things you need to do, change everything that you do overnight. This is the right way. This is the path. And those changes rarely stick, right? They don't have the buy-in, and they're not teaching teams to ask themselves those questions. And really, it's about asking, what are the things that I want? What are the outcomes I want? What are the outcomes I'm getting? And how might our processes be impacting that outcome? And how might we, like, those are the kinds of questions to get people. And then it doesn't matter what problem they face, might not be the same one that you supported them on. It might be another problem a year later. If you can teach that model, then that's how they start to approach trying to get different outcomes and trying to implement change.
Yeah, and this is the sustainability factor, as people have said for decades related to substance use. It's easy to quit drinking. I've done it 1,000 times. Right. Sustaining change in a system as a person, that's where it's at, right? It's not about making a change is important, and it's the beginning of an opportunity toward a different path. Then sustainment as a system. It's easy to do something different as an organization. It takes a whole nother level of dedication and infrastructure and prioritization to sustain whatever that is, to keep it going.
And there is such a thing as change fatigue, and I think our world is experiencing quite a bit of that right now. And I do see that ripple effect on teams that, like, don't ask me to do one more thing because the world swirling around us is so ripe with change that it gets really exhausting. And so, how do you help people kind of with that kind of change exhaustion?
Yeah, I always try to be very realistic. And one of the things I always like to do when I go into a system to help them is I often say, well, let me just sit down, not recording, not going to identify any of the parties. Let me sit down with some of the direct service providing staff and just have a focus group with them around some of the key issues that seem to be of concern. And that's where we get a sense of their beliefs, their worldview, some of their stressors. And then that's where we can kind of gauge some of this stuff. And change fatigue or implementation fatigue is a real factor that comes up there. Well, they, as in leadership, keep asking us to do all this stuff, and I don't even know what it is or why, or I don't even kind of agree with it because it doesn't fit with my worldview, because here's my path toward my own personal recovery and how I did this. And they're asking me to do something that I don't really understand or appreciate, or it makes me nervous. And so what happens is the leaderships will say, well, we have people who are traditionalists, who are old school thinkers. And I try to say, well, let's not judge. Instead, let's say they're worried. They have concerns about this. They're concerned that it will maybe not be helpful or be harmful or create risks for some of the people who they're dedicated to helping. That's the issue we need to talk about, right? Not let their old school thinkers. This is not helpful to judge people as, like old school in a pejorative way. Let's talk about how they have worries. Of course they have worries. Well, let's share those. Let's get those out on the table and talk about them. And often it is, we're just tired, right? Especially in today's economy around these kinds of services. Lots of staff turnover, lots of programs at 50, 60% of their desired staffing. Yeah, of course they're tired. And when we ask them to do something new, of course they're going to be hesitating, not because they don't want to do the best and highest quality practice, but because they're tired. And so we need to honor that and figure that out. And sometimes say, right, it's not proper and healthy for us to do this new thing right now. It's like they just ran 10 miles and we're saying, okay, let's do some sprints now. No, that's not, no, we need to give them some space to catch their breath here before we think about it. So again, designing the implementation based upon the individuals, the people, the program, which is people, rather than saying there's a standard implementation that everybody should do. Well, everybody's different and we need to tailor it accordingly. We need to make adaptations accordingly.
Yeah, even teams within one system can be very different.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. And so starting with that small team-based, what does this look like for you? What matters to you?
Yeah.
Is very different than we're just going to do this across the board. And it strikes me of, I really appreciate your approach, both with folks you support, but also with systems that you support, of starting from that place of non-judgmental empathy. And it makes me think of that, like, kind of harm reduction tree, and applying that to those that we're trying to support. Like, if we believe the roots of them are that it's their way of the highway, they don't really care, they don't really want change, then we're not going to be able to help them make change. But if we believe that the root there is that they're worried because they do care.
Yeah, we have to
Right?
respect their position. We don't have to share that worldview, and we have to respect that worldview and talk about what that means as it relates to change. And I completely agree with you. The subcultures within an organization, there's an organizational culture, and that's not all. We have to then look at the subcultures program by program. If you look at across all of your programs, you can see very distinctive subcultures. Like, this is the same level and type of care as that is, but boy, do they have very different cultures. So that's something we have to always be mindful of.
Yeah. Well, this has been such a treat and a fun conversation to have you on, Matt. If folks want to learn more, they can go online and look up kind of the NIATx model. You do a lot of training, so certainly, folks can look at opportunities for you to do training and to support them in different ways. But I just really appreciate this conversation and appreciate the work you do and the opportunity I have to work with you.
Yeah, me too, Lisa. It's always great to talk with you and work with you, and this has been a really enjoyable conversation. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, everybody. We missed you, Jesse. I'm sure you would have had some wonderful thoughts to share. I'm sure you'll share them with me later. We've got some great summer episodes that we are planning, and then ramping up for our big month, which is always September, for Recovery Month, where we do weekly episodes. So thanks, everybody, for listening. Feel free to subscribe, do all of those things on the podcast. Until next time, thanks for joining us. Bye now.